All of you very good morning students. Today topic transport of gases. Transport of gases. Our body presenting on the blood. That blood functioning is the circulation. The heart the circulate to the all the body parts. So the blood is the medium of the transport of gases. Blood is medium of transport of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the blood is the medium of transport of the gases. The gases are the transport of the blood circulatory system from the lungs to tissues. The blood is the medium of transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. First one, transport of oxygen. Transport of oxygen. Transport of oxygen. So the oxygen they transport the blood plasma and RBC. The transport of the oxygen from the blood plasma and RBC. So they are transported from the lungs to body tissues. The oxygen is transported by the lungs to body tissues. The oxygen is transported the two ways. One is the plasma is transported to the oxygen. The red blood cells is transported to the oxygen. The oxygen is transported by blood plasma and RBC, red blood cells. These two is the transport of the oxygen from the lungs to body tissues. Lungs to tissues. The oxygen transported from the lungs to body tissues in the two ways. One is the blood plasma. Another one is the red blood cells. Red blood cells is the transport of the oxygen. Blood plasma is the transport of the oxygen. First one, transport of oxygen by plasma. Transport of oxygen by plasma. So the plasma is transport of oxygen. How much percentage? Only 3% of oxygen. 3% of oxygen they transport of the blood plasma through the dissolved state. The transport of the dissolved state, the plasma dissolving of the oxygen. The dissolved oxygen they transport to the lungs to tissues. How much percentage? Only 3%. 3% of oxygen they transport from the lungs to tissues. From the dissolved state of the plasma, they transport of the oxygen. Dissolved state, they transport of the oxygen. Next one, the transport of the oxygen by RBC. Transport of oxygen. Transport of O2 by red blood cells. Transport of oxygen by red blood cells. How much percentage? 97%. 97% of oxygen they transport of red blood cells. 97% of the oxygen they transport of the red blood cells from the lungs to body tissues. The red blood cells. Red blood cell contain red color pigment. They are the hemoglobin. Red blood cell contain a red color pigment is the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is the iron. The iron contain hemoglobin. That hemoglobin contain a heme molecules, 4 heme molecules and 4 polypeptide chains. So the RBC contain a hemoglobin. That hemoglobin is the transport of the oxygen. the transport of the oxygen. So, they are the majorly the primarily the transport of the oxygen majorly depending on the partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen majorly depending on the transport of the gases, the transport of the gases. So, the oxygen they transport of the RBC presenting on the hemoglobin, that hemoglobin they transport of the oxygen. So, the majorly depending on the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of the oxygen they depend on the transport of the oxygen transport. Next one, the one hemoglobin molecule, one heme molecule is the transport of the 4 oxygen molecules. One heme molecules. One heme molecules they transport of the 4 oxygen molecules. The transport of the one heme molecules it is transport of the 4 oxygen molecules, like so these are the hemoglobin. So, they are the presenting on the 4 heme polypeptide chains, 1 O2, 1 O2, 1 O2, 1 O2. So, they are the transport of the binding of the hemoglobin, the binding of the oxygen. So, they are the transport of the one heme molecule, the transport of the 4 oxygen molecules. Normally 100 ml of oxygenated blood, the 100 ml of oxygenated blood they transport of the 5 ml of oxygen, the transport of the 5 ml of oxygen. The 100 ml of oxygen oxygenated blood they contain a 5 ml of oxygen. Next one, in the tissues, the lungs. In lungs, oxygen partial pressure high. In the lungs, oxygen partial pressure is high, the CO2 partial pressure is low. CO2 partial pressure is low. That time the oxygen binding to hemoglobin, they form to oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. In the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is high. In the lungs, oxygen pressure is high, CO2 pressure is low. So, the oxygen they binding of the hemoglobin, oxygen binding to the hemoglobin. So, the formation of the oxyhemoglobin, that oxyhemoglobin they transport to the body parts. So, these are the hemoglobin. Four O2 molecules. So, they are formation of the HbO2 4. So, they are the hemoglobin, they are the oxygen. So, they are the formation of the oxyhemoglobin. These oxyhemoglobin they transport to the body parts. So, in the tissues, in the tissues CO2 partial pressure is high, O2 partial pressure low. O2 partial pressure is low, CO2 partial pressure is high. So, these oxyhemoglobin is divided into Hb plus 4O2. So, they are the dissociation. So, the oxygen and hemoglobin, these two is the dissociation. So, these are the transport of the oxygen. So, in the lungs, the oxygen partial pressure is high. So, the hemoglobin is binding to the oxygen. So, the formation of the oxyhemoglobin. These oxyhemoglobin, they transport of the lungs to tissues. In the tissues, the CO2 partial pressure is high, O2 partial pressure is low. The CO2 is binding to the hemoglobin. That oxyhemoglobin dissociation, the separation of the hemoglobin and oxygen. So, the oxygen is transported to the tissues. In the tissues presenting on the CO2, that CO2 binding of the hemoglobin. So, they are transported to the lungs. So, they are the transport of the oxygen. The majorly the transport of the oxygen depending on the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of CO2, next one temperature and pH, pressure of hydrogen ions. So, they are all depending on the transport of the oxygen. So, in the CO2 levels are in the lungs, CO2 levels are decreases. The temperature also decreases, only pH is the increase. So, that time the binding of the oxygen and hemoglobin, the formation of the oxyhemoglobin, they transport to the tissues. In the tissues, the CO2 level is high, O2 level is low. That time the dissociation, the hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, dissociation of the oxygen and hemoglobin. So, these are the transport of the gases. Next one, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So, these are the curve. This like curve is a sigmoid curve. This shape is the sigmoid shape. This graph, that shape is the sigmoid shape. So, this curve is called the sigmoid curve. So, they are in the one way pressure of oxygen, the one way the oxyhemoglobin saturation, the binding of the oxyhemoglobin. This dissociation curve, this curve to the left, this curve turn to the left, they are the binding of the oxyhemoglobin. These are the left. So, they are the binding of the oxygen and hemoglobin. This curve turn to the right side. This curve turn to the right side. So, they are the dissociation, division of the oxygen and hemoglobin. So, these are the curve, they are the graph. So, they are the graph. This graph is the identification of the binding of the oxygen and hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin formation and oxyhemoglobin dissociation, identification of the oxyhemoglobin formation, oxyhemoglobin dissociation. This curve is the turn to the left side, So, the increase of the percentage of the increase of the oxyhemoglobin. So, they turn to the right side. So, they are the dissociation of the oxyhemoglobin. For example, the partial pressure of O2 is the 40%. So, that time they are only 70% of the oxyhemoglobin formation. So, 50% of the pressure of O2. So, they are formed by the 80% of the oxyhemoglobin formation. In the 60 time, so they are formation of the 90% of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So, the majorly oxyhemoglobin formation depending on the high pressure of ions, low CO2 and low temperature. Formation of the oxyhemoglobin saturation, the factors high pH, low CO2, low temperature. Next one, the dissociation of the oxyhemoglobin, that factors are the low pH, high CO2, high temperature, low pH, high CO2, high temperature. So, they are the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. 2 marks, very important. This graph only draw the graph oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So, this like draw this diagram, 2 marks, very important. So, they are the major function, identification of the formation of the oxyhemoglobin formation and dissociation of the oxyhemoglobin. So, these are the transport of the gases. Transport of the gases, majorly blood is the medium of transport of the gases. So, they are the O2 and CO2. The oxygen is transferred to the two waves, one is the plasma, one is the red blood cells. plasma only transport to the 3% of the oxygen transport to the dissolved state. The red blood cells 97% of the oxygen transport to the lungs to body tissues. The red blood cells contain a hemoglobin. That hemoglobin contain a heme molecules. The one hemoglobin carry the 4 oxygen molecules. One hemoglobin carry the 4 oxygen molecules. Hemoglobin bind to oxygen, they formation of the oxyhemoglobin. In the lungs, the oxygen partial pressure is high. So, the hemoglobin binding to the oxygen. In the tissues, the oxygen partial pressure is low. So, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation, separation of the hemoglobin and oxygen. So, these are the transport of the oxygen. Next class, we discuss the transport of the carbon dioxide.